Today is day 4 of Unit 6. So we started today with a ticket in the door quiz. So if you missed class, make sure you see me to make that up. And then we did this warm up here. So pause the video, take a moment, try the warm-up, and then play to check your answers. So this is a proportion. We know that when we're solving proportions, one fraction equal to another fraction, the best way to solve a proportion is to cross multiply. So if I multiply 3 times the quantity x minus 1, that should equal 2x times 1, which is just 2x. So 3x minus 3 should equal 2x. So negative 3 should equal, subtracting 3x from both sides, negative x, which means x should be equal to 3. So it does say check your solutions. So one way to check would be to substitute 3 back in. So 3 divided by 2 times 3 should equal 1 over 3 minus 1. So 3 over 6 should equal 1/2. 3/6 does equal 1/2, so that checks. So x equals 3 is a solution. Okay, so now in class, what we talked about was that's the way that probably most of you checked it initially, but I explained that there is another way you can check your solutions. And really what we're concerned about when we're doing the check is we're concerned if the solution that we get is part of the domain restrictions. Because remember, if it's part of the domain restrictions, then that value for x will make the denominator 0, which will make the function undefined, and we don't want that. So really, if you just figure out what the domain restrictions are, which in this case x cannot equal 0 or 1, and make sure that your solution is not on that list of domain restrictions, then you can be certain that value would work. Now, of course, that's not going to check that you didn't make a mistake in your solving, but that is going to check that your solution is not a value that makes the function undefined. So that is an acceptable way of checking that your answer is okay in terms of it won't make the function undefined. So because 3 is not on the domain restriction list, then it's an acceptable answer. And I don't have to throw it out. Now, had 3 been on the domain restriction list, I would be crossing off 3 and I'd be writing no solution. So we started with this example, and we talked about the fact that we know that just from our work earlier this week, that we know that we first need to factor. So we factored the numerator, or I'm sorry, the denominator of that first fraction. And then next step we know from our work earlier this week is, again, to figure out the domain restrictions. So looking at the denominators, x can't equal 0, x can't equal 3. Okay, now from here on, the problem's a little bit different than the problems we've done previously. So previously, we were simplifying expressions. Here, I'm not simplifying an expression, I'm solving an equation. So not only does the problem look different, there's an equal sign, I'm solving, the directions look different, but my answer is going to look different. I'm going to have x equals a number as my answer, whereas the rest of the problems we did this week were simplifying rational expressions. So our answer looked like a rational expression. It was a rational expression. Okay, so that's different. Secondly, even though in the warm-up we were solving, that was a proportion, one fraction equaling another fraction. This is not like that. We are still solving, but it's not like that because we don't have a proportion. We have more than one fraction. So we can't even go about it with the same approach as we did in the warm-up. We're not going to cross multiply here. What we are going to do is use a technique you learned in Algebra 1 called fraction busters, which basically is a, I don't know, weird name for the fact that we're going to get rid of these fractions so that we can solve. So the way that we're going to get rid of these fractions is by looking at the denominators and figuring out what the least common denominator would be. We're not going to get a common denominator, but we're going to multiply by the common denominator on both sides of the equation. So if I look at x, x minus 3, x, and x minus 3, I can see that x times the quantity x minus 3 is the least common denominator. So again, I'm not going to get a common denominator, but I am going to multiply everything by that common denominator. So both sides of the equation. So I'm going to go ahead and put that over 1. Now, just like we did the other day when we were simplifying the complex fractions, remember we figured out what the least common denominator was there, and we multiplied both numerator and denominator by that. Just like that, same thing as back then, a couple days ago, I said take time and write out all the terms. So same thing here. Rather than just looking here and crossing off common factors, that's going to get confusing because some of the common factors with x and x minus 3 are in this first fraction and some are in the second. So it gets confusing which goes with which if you don't take time to write it out separately, which we are going to do. So x times x minus 3 over 1 is times this first fraction, 3 over x times x minus 3. And then there's a plus sign. 4 over x is times x minus 3 over 1. Then equal sign. Now on the right here, I can cross off common factors because I have multiplication going on. So I have just x times 1, which is just x. So now I can distribute, or actually I'm going to look on the diagonals and cross off common factors. So that whole thing is gone, which leaves me just a 3. Plus sign, the x's are gone. I have 4 distributed to the quantity x minus 3, which is 4x minus 12, and that equals x on the right. So now we can continue on. We can combine like terms 4x minus 9 equals x, and of course subtract 4x from both sides, and divide by negative 3, x is equal to 3. Now, we already took time, though, to get the domain restriction, so remember, the check really just means check the domain restrictions and confirm that it is a solution or cross it off if it's not. So we said 3 cannot be a solution. And I only had that one solution in the first place, which means there is no solution. Okay, again, now had 3 not been on my domain restriction list, then I would have included that as a solution. Okay, so that work right there, that really is your work for the check. Next. Okay, so you want to get that copied into your notes. We're going to start this one the same way. We're going to factor anything that we can. So it looks like that first rational expression doesn't factor. Neither does the second one. The numerator doesn't factor for the third, but the denominator does. So now that I have the denominators factored, I can figure out the domain restrictions. X can't equal positive or negative 2. So now I'm ready to figure out what the least common denominator is. So between x plus 2, x minus 2, and x plus 2 times x minus 2, I can see that the quantity x plus 2 times quantity x minus 2 is the least common denominator. So I'm going to take both sides of the equation and I'm going to multiply by that LCD. So on the right, I'm going to go ahead and cross off common factors on the diagonal that are being multiplied, and I can see that I'm left with x squared plus 4. But on the left, I'm going to write out each of these fractions separately times the least common denominator. Again, I'm allowed to do that because I'm just distributing. Okay, so each one of those fractions times the LCD over 1. So now I can look on diagonals and cross off common factors. And that leaves me with x times the quantity x minus 2, which is x squared minus 2x. Now, this is like what we talked about yesterday, excuse me, when we were simplifying or adding or subtracting rational expressions. I told you minus, it's easier if you change that to plus the opposite sign. So now we'll think of that as negative x rather than minus. So we're going to distribute negative x to x and negative x to positive 2, which gives us negative x squared minus 2x. And now I can see that the x squareds are like terms on the same side, and the negative 2x and negative 2x become negative 4x. And I can see I have a quadratic equation. We know from our previous unit we solve quadratic equations either by factoring, completing the square, sometimes square roots, but not possible here because of the x, or lastly, quadratic formula. Each one of those techniques, we need to have the quadratic equation set equal to 0. So that means I need this set equal to 0, which means I'm going to add 4x to both sides. So x squared plus 4x plus 4 equals 0, which that's factorable. Might as well factor it. Solving, that's a 2. Solving, that gives us x equals negative 2 twice. And then I'm checking my domain restrictions. And unfortunately, it's on the restriction list. So just like the last problem we did, it needs to be crossed off. And because there was only one solution and it's not actually a solution, it makes the function undefined. Then I write no solution. Okay. Now, keep in mind, a lot of times when you get to this point, if you have something that's quadratic, you should get 2 solutions. It's just this one, because we had the x plus 2 twice, we ended up with just one value. But a lot of times you'll have 2 solutions here. So if that's the case, you have 2 different numbers, you have to check both of them compared to the restriction list. And sometimes it'll work out that maybe both are on the list. Sometimes, and you'll cross it off and write no solution. Sometimes maybe one is on the restriction list and the other's not, in which case you would cross the one off and circle the other. And sometimes maybe both are, neither are on the restriction list, in which case both would be solutions. So just keep in mind that's going to depend on the problem. But in this case, we only got one answer and it was on the restriction list, therefore we have no solution. Okay. So your assignment for tonight is to complete all of worksheet number 8, and then in your Unit 6 packet, pages 7 and 8, the odds on both pages. So the odds on page 7, the odds on page 8, but all of worksheet number 8. Next week, you do have a quiz coming up on Monday on everything we've covered so far in Unit 6.